Jimmy Bakker was once one of the most recognizable pastors in modern American history, a man who preached heaven on television screens across the world while quietly building an empire fueled by greed, deception, and moral collapse. Born in 1940 in Muskegon, Michigan, Bakker grew up immersed in Pentecostal Christianity, surrounded by sermons about salvation, sacrifice, and divine reward. By his early adulthood, he had already learned something crucial, not just how to preach faith, but how to sell it. In the 1970s and 1980s, Bakker rose to prominence as a televangelist, co-founding what would become the PTL Club, short for Praise the Lord, or, as critics later joked, Pass the Loot. The program blended Christian preaching with entertainment, heartfelt testimonies with glossy production, and constant fundraising appeals with promises of spiritual transformation. Bakker's style was warm and emotive. He spoke not as a stern preacher, but as a friendly guide, someone who seemed to understand personal struggle, doubt, and hope. For millions of viewers, he felt trustworthy. Behind the broadcasts, Bakker and his wife Tammy Faye were constructing a sprawling religious commercial enterprise. The centerpiece was Heritage USA, a Christian theme park in South Carolina, marketed as a spiritual alternative to Disneyland. Supporters were told they were funding a holy refuge, a place for families to reconnect with God, away from the corruption of the secular world. Donations poured in from elderly pensioners, struggling families, and deeply faithful viewers who believed their money was serving God's mission. What many of them were never told was how that money was actually being used. Bakker's fundraising machine relied heavily on a program called Lifetime Partnerships. Viewers were promised lifetime lodging at Heritage USA in exchange for financial contributions. These promises were repeated relentlessly on air, framed as both an earthly blessing and a heavenly investment. In reality, Bakker sold far more partnerships than the facilities could ever accommodate. Tens of thousands of supporters believed they were entitled to benefits that would never exist. As donations skyrocketed, Bakker's personal lifestyle became increasingly extravagant. He lived in luxury while preaching humility. He traveled in private jets while urging viewers to sacrifice. Reports later revealed expenses that included gold-plated bathroom fixtures, lavish mansions, luxury cars, and personal spending that blatantly contradicted the values he preached. Faith wasn't just his calling, it was his business model. Cracks began to form in the late 1980s. Internal whistleblowers, skeptical journalists, and financial investigators started asking questions about the flow of money inside PTL. Where exactly were the donations going? How were funds being accounted for? Why were financial records so tightly controlled? Bakker responded not with transparency, but with deflection, intimidation, and spiritual rhetoric. Critics were labeled enemies of God. Doubters were accused of attacking the church. Then came the scandal that accelerated everything. In 1987, reports surfaced that Bakker had paid hush money to silence a former church secretary who accused him of sexual assault. The revelation stunned his audience. For many supporters, the pastor who preached righteousness had crossed not only a moral line, but a criminal one. Bakker initially confessed to an immoral relationship, framing it as a lapse for which God had forgiven him. But the damage was irreversible. As attention intensified, financial investigations uncovered the full scope of the fraud. Federal authorities found that PTL had become a vast scheme of financial deception. Millions of dollars in donations had been misused, misrepresented, and outright stolen. Bakker hadn't just failed spiritually, he had systematically exploited faith for personal gain. In 1989, Jimmy Bakker was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. His trial became a media spectacle, watched closely by both religious communities and the general public. Prosecutors laid out meticulous evidence showing how Bakker knowingly oversold partnerships, diverted donor funds, and misled supporters on a massive scale. Former followers testified about giving away life savings because they trusted Bakker's promises of divine reward. The verdict was devastating. Bakker was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison, along with a massive fine. While the sentence was later reduced on appeal, the symbolic weight of it was immense. A pastor who once claimed to speak for God was now branded a con artist in the eyes of the law. The aftermath rippled far beyond Bakker himself. The televangelist movement suffered a major blow to its credibility. Faith leaders scrambled to distance themselves from PTL. Donors pulled back. Churches faced growing skepticism from the public. For many viewers, Bakker's downfall planted a seed of doubt that would never fully fade. If this preacher lied, who else might be lying too? Bakker served several years in prison and was released in the mid-1990s. Remarkably, he returned to ministry once again, presenting himself as a humbled man, redeemed by suffering. To some followers, this was a story of forgiveness. To others, it was a final insult to a man who had already abused trust, asking for it once more. Victims of Bakker's deception were left with little closure. Many never recovered their lost savings. Elderly supporters found themselves financially devastated. Families who believed they were investing in God's work realized they had funded personal luxury and systemic fraud instead. Faith, once a source of comfort, had become a source of shame and betrayal. Jimmy Bakker's story is not just about one corrupt pastor. It's about what happens when belief is monetized, when charisma replaces accountability, and when religious authority is allowed to operate without oversight. He didn't steal in the shadows, he stole in plain sight, wrapped in scripture and broadcast to millions. The haunting question left behind is simple but unsettling. How many believers still confuse faith with trust in a personality? And how many modern pastors continue to preach heaven while secretly living in sin? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Peter Ball spent decades standing at altars across England, dressed in clerical robes, speaking softly about humility, repentance, and the cleansing power of faith. To the outside world, he appeared gentle, almost fragile, a deeply spiritual man devoted to celibacy, prayer, and guiding lost souls toward God. But behind closed doors, Ball lived a double life, rooted not in holiness, but in manipulation, coercion, and sexual abuse carried out under the protection of religious authority. Born in 1932 in England, Peter Ball entered religious life young. He quickly developed a reputation as a man of intense spirituality. His sermons focused heavily on purity, self-denial, and the struggle against temptation. This message resonated strongly, especially among young men seeking direction, discipline, and spiritual meaning. Ball understood vulnerability and he understood how to exploit it. By the 1970s, Ball had climbed the ecclesiastical ladder, eventually becoming Bishop of Lewes within the Church of England. His influence expanded rapidly. He founded religious communities centered on strict asceticism and obedience, drawing in young men who admired his perceived holiness. Many believed they were entering a sacred mentorship. What they were actually entering was a carefully constructed trap. Ball's abuse followed a chillingly consistent pattern. He targeted young men struggling with identity, faith, or sin. He framed their emotional confusion as spiritual failure, convincing them that obedience to him was obedience to God. Private spiritual counseling sessions became tools of control. Victims later described being coerced into naked rituals, physical contact, and psychological submission, all disguised as religious purification. What made Ball especially dangerous was the way he blended abuse with doctrine. He taught that suffering could cleanse sin, that humiliation was a path to holiness, that resistance was evidence of spiritual weakness. Victims were left deeply confused, shamed not only of what had happened to them, but of their own doubts. Many believed they had failed God. The abuse went on for years. By the early 1990s, some victims finally found the courage to speak. Allegations were reported to church authorities and police. What followed was not justice but silence. Senior figures within the Church of England downplayed the claims. Internal handling replaced criminal investigation. Ball was quietly encouraged to step back from public ministry, framed not as a predator but as a man overwhelmed by stress. In 1993, Ball accepted a police caution for gross indecency, an extraordinary moment that should have ended his influence permanently. Instead, he continued to have access to victims. The caution was not widely disclosed. The church failed to warn congregations. Ball was allowed to remain within religious circles, treated with sympathy rather than scrutiny. Even more disturbing was the role played by powerful allies outside the church. Ball was well connected, admired by figures in Britain's upper class. Written support was provided by influential individuals who described him as gentle, misunderstood, and spiritually valuable. Their words carried weight. Their intervention helped neutralize accountability. For years after the caution, Ball quietly continued to wield influence. Survivors struggled alone, many slipping into depression, addiction, and suicidal ideation. Some left religion entirely unable to separate faith from the abuse inflicted in God's name. Others tried to speak again but were ignored, dismissed, or re-traumatized by institutional indifference. It wasn't until the 2010s, amid growing public reckoning over sexual abuse in religious institutions, that Ball's case re-emerged. Investigative journalists and survivor advocates forced the Church of England to confront its past. The scale of the failure became impossible to deny. In 2015, more than 2 decades after the first allegations, Peter Ball finally stood trial. The courtroom painted a devastating picture: decades of abuse, countless victims, and systematic protection by those who should have defended the vulnerable. Testimonies revealed how Ball used scripture as a weapon, turning faith into leverage and confession into captivity. Ball pleaded guilty to multiple counts of misconduct and abuse. He was sentenced to prison at the age of 83, though the sentence was symbolic compared to the lifetime damage inflicted. It represented something survivors had been denied for decades: acknowledgement. The fallout was seismic. The Church of England issued public apologies. Independent investigations confirmed what survivors had long said, that institutional failure, deference to power, and fear of scandal had enabled abuse to continue. Policies were rewritten. Safeguarding became mandatory. But for many victims, the reforms came far too late. Peter Ball died in 2019. He never expressed genuine public remorse. His legacy is not one of redemption, but of betrayal of faith, trust, and the most basic moral responsibility of a pastor. His story exposes a brutal truth: corruption doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers from a pulpit, cloaked in gentleness and scripture, protected not by secrecy alone, but by respectability. When pastors preach heaven but live in sin, the damage extends far beyond individual crimes. It fractures faith itself. It teaches victims that silence is holiness, and suffering is obedience. And it leaves behind a chilling lesson: evil does not always look monstrous. Sometimes it looks holy. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. This man was never questioned, because questioning him meant questioning God. For years, James J.P. Miller was trusted without hesitation. He was a youth pastor, a mentor, a man welcomed into homes, camps, and churches because parents believed he was safe. And when concerns surfaced, they were handled quietly, just enough to protect the institution, never enough to protect the children. J.P. Miller built his reputation inside modern evangelical church spaces, where youth ministries often operate with minimal oversight. He was charismatic, approachable, and deeply embedded in church life. Parents saw him as a positive influence. Teenagers saw him as someone who listened. That access mattered. Youth pastors occupy a unique position of trust. They are not distant authority figures. They are close, relational, and informal. That closeness creates opportunity when boundaries are weak and accountability is absent. According to verified court records and victim testimony, concerns about Miller's behavior began long before law enforcement became involved. Teenagers described inappropriate messages, late-night communication, emotional dependency, and gradual boundary erosion. The behavior was not immediately recognized as criminal, and that ambiguity was precisely what allowed it to continue. When early complaints reached church leadership, they were not treated as emergencies. Instead, the response followed a familiar pattern. Meetings were held internally. Miller was spoken to privately. Guidelines were reaffirmed. No police report was filed. Church leaders later acknowledged that they believed the matter could be handled spiritually, through counseling, prayer, and supervision. The emphasis was on restoration, not accountability. But while leadership deliberated, abuse continued. Victims later testified that Miller used religious language to manipulate trust. He framed secrecy as loyalty. He blurred the line between mentorship and intimacy. He reassured victims that what was happening was misunderstood, or worse, that it was mutual. When some teenagers tried to pull away, when others tried to speak up, they were afraid no one would believe them. In several instances, records show that Miller was quietly removed from certain duties, only to resurface in similar roles at other churches. Information was not shared. Warnings were not communicated. The pattern repeated. It was only after multiple victims came forward independently that law enforcement became involved. Investigators discovered digital evidence, messages, images, and timelines that confirmed abuse had occurred over an extended period. By then, the damage was extensive. Miller was arrested and charged with multiple counts related to sexual exploitation and abuse of minors. The charges were severe, and they raised an unavoidable question. Why had this taken so long? During the trial, testimony revealed that church leaders had been aware of concerning behavior years earlier. Internal emails and notes showed discussions about risk and reputation. Decisions were made to avoid scandal. Records existed. They were not destroyed outright. They were compartmentalized, kept informal, left out of official channels where mandatory reporting would have been triggered. In court, survivors spoke about more than the abuse. They spoke about betrayal. They described trusting adults who promised protection and then watched as those adults chose silence. They described being encouraged to forgive before they were ever believed. Miller was convicted and sentenced to prison. But for victims, the conviction did not erase what followed them into adulthood: anxiety, broken trust, difficulty forming relationships, and the lingering sense that their safety had been negotiable. The church issued statements, expressing sorrow and acknowledging mistakes. Policies were updated. Safeguarding training was implemented. All of it came after the fact. This case exposes a modern reality. Abuse does not always hide behind ancient tradition or distant hierarchy. Sometimes it hides behind youth group pizza nights, text messages, and the assumption that good intentions equals safety. The erasure here was subtle. No dramatic shredding of documents, no secret vaults, just conversations not documented, decisions not escalated, concerns not reported. And that silence was enough. The victims remained carrying not only the trauma of abuse, but the knowledge that intervention had been possible and withheld. When institutions choose internal handling over external accountability, they do not prevent harm, they delay it. And in that delay, more victims are created. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Ulf Ekman stood at the center of one of Scandinavia's most influential modern Christian movements, a pastor whose voice shaped tens of thousands of believers across Sweden and Europe. Charismatic, articulate, and fiercely confident, Ekman preached about divine authority, spiritual warfare, and the rewards of obedience. For many followers, he was not just a preacher, he was a prophet. But beneath the polished sermons and global conferences was a slow-burning corruption of power, money, and control that would leave an entire faith community fractured and betrayed. Born in 1950 in Sweden, Ekman trained in theology before encountering the American Word of Faith movement in the late 1970s. What he absorbed there would define his ministry: prosperity doctrine, unquestioned pastoral authority, and the belief that spiritual leaders were divinely appointed and therefore beyond ordinary criticism. When Ekman returned to Sweden, he brought this ideology with him, an approach that clashed sharply with the country's traditionally restrained Lutheran culture. In 1983, Ekman founded Word of Life, Livets Ord, in Uppsala. What began as a small charismatic congregation rapidly evolved into a powerful religious institution, complete with its own Bible school, publishing arm, global missions, and media presence. Ekman's sermons were intense and authoritative. He claimed spiritual insight into world events, personal destinies, and divine will. Followers were taught that obedience to leadership was obedience to God. Money played a central role from the beginning. Congregants were encouraged, often pressured, to give generously, framed not just as charity but as spiritual investment. Financial sacrifice was linked to divine blessing. Doubt was framed as spiritual weakness. Former members later recalled being urged to take loans, donate inheritances, and prioritize church giving over personal stability. Ekman insisted that prosperity would follow faith, and that questioning the flow of money demonstrated distrust in God. Critics soon emerged, warning that Word of Life operated more like a corporation than a church. Financial transparency was limited. Leadership decision-making was centralized around Ekman and a small inner circle. Dissenters were marginalized, labeled rebellious, or accused of spiritual failure. Yet the movement continued to grow, attracting international attention and political connections. By the 1990s, Word of Life had become deeply entangled in global missionary work, including controversial operations in Eastern Europe and parts of the former Soviet Union. Ekman publicly aligned himself with authoritarian regimes he believed supported Christian values, downplaying human rights concerns in favor of ideological alignment. These choices disturbed observers, who questioned whether faith was being used to justify proximity to power rather than moral accountability. Inside the movement, former insiders describe an atmosphere of fear masked as devotion. Questioning leadership was dangerous not legally, but spiritually. Members were warned that leaving the church could invite divine punishment or personal ruin. Relationships outside the movement were discouraged. Ekman's voice dominated not only sermons, but personal decisions involving marriage, career, and family. As years passed, scandals quietly mounted. Former Bible school students came forward describing psychological manipulation, coercive practices, and emotional abuse. Some reported that Ekman's teachings fostered guilt, dependency, and identity loss. Others spoke about authoritarian discipline disguised as spiritual correction. While criminal charges were rare, the ethical damage was profound. Then came the moment that shattered the movement. In 2014, without warning, Ulf Ekman announced his departure, not just from Word of Life, but from Protestantism entirely. He revealed that he was converting to Roman Catholicism. For tens of thousands of followers who had been taught that Catholicism was doctrinally corrupt, spiritually dangerous, and fundamentally wrong, the announcement was devastating. The shock was not theological, it was existential. Ekman had spent decades presenting his spiritual authority as divinely inspired and unquestionably correct. He had demanded loyalty, sacrifice, and obedience based on that authority. Now, without apology, he declared that he had been wrong. Not partially wrong, fundamentally wrong. Former followers described the experience as spiritual whiplash. If Ekman had been mistaken about core truths, what else had been built on illusion? What had their sacrifices been for? Where did responsibility lie for the years of financial pressure, emotional control, and fractured relationships? Ekman offered no systematic reckoning. He did not address accusations of manipulation. He did not invite independent investigation. He framed his conversion as a personal journey guided by God, leaving followers to reconcile decades of absolute claims with sudden humility. For many, this silent retreat felt like abandonment. In Sweden, journalists began revisiting Word of Life's past. Reports highlighted the lack of accountability, the culture of submission, and the human toll on former members. Mental health professionals noted patterns common to high-control religious movements: loss of autonomy, fear-based loyalty, and difficulties reintegrating into society after leaving. Though Ekman was never convicted of financial crimes, his case exposes another form of corruption, one that hides behind legality: the corruption of influence, the moral breach of demanding total trust while refusing total accountability, the sin of shaping lives irrevocably without owning the consequences. Word of Life continues to exist today, though in a transformed and diminished state. Many leaders distanced themselves from Ekman's legacy. Others quietly left. A generation of believers was left questioning not only a pastor, but the very concept of spiritual authority. The story of Ulf Ekman is not about handcuffs or prison sentences. It is about the damage done when faith becomes centralized around one man's certainty, when obedience replaces conscience, when questioning is treated as betrayal. He preached heaven with conviction. He demanded belief without doubt. And yet, when the foundation cracked, he walked away from the structure he built, leaving his followers to sift through the rubble alone. The chilling reality is this: corruption does not always end in scandal. Sometimes it ends in silence, unanswered questions, and a generation struggling to rebuild trust after surrendering it completely. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the quiet Swedish village of Knutby, surrounded by forests and farmland, few residents imagined their community would become synonymous with one of Europe's most disturbing religious crime cases. Knutby was a place of order, routine, and deep Lutheran tradition, exactly the kind of environment where faith carried weight and authority figures were rarely questioned. At the center of that environment stood Pastor Helge Fossmo, a man who preached devotion, obedience, and divine purpose while orchestrating manipulation, abuse, and ultimately, murder. Born in 1971, Fossmo did not begin his life as a monster in the public eye. He was intelligent, articulate, and deeply interested in theology. In the late 1990s, he became associated with the Knutby Philadelphia congregation, a Pentecostal group that had gradually drifted away from mainstream religious oversight. What distinguished Knutby was not just its doctrine, but its intensity. Members lived close to one another, worshipped together constantly, and submitted deeply personal aspects of their lives to church leadership. At the heart of Kunpi's belief system was the idea that God communicated directly through chosen individuals. This belief became the gateway through which Fossmo would exercise absolute control. By the early 2000s, Fossmo had risen to become one of the congregation's most influential pastors. He positioned himself as spiritually enlightened, capable of interpreting divine will with clarity others lacked. Members were encouraged to trust him completely, to surrender doubt as a sign of humility. Questioning leadership was framed as rebellion, not against the church, but against God himself. This atmosphere of submission allowed Fossmo to begin a pattern of exploitation that went undetected for years. Privately, Fossmo engaged in multiple secret sexual relationships with women within the congregation, many of whom were emotionally vulnerable and spiritually dependent. He justified these relationships using scripture twisted into personal prophecy. Women were told their suffering was divinely ordained, that obedience, even when painful, would lead to spiritual growth. Guilt and fear were constant tools in his control. One of the most disturbing aspects of Fossmo's behavior was how he communicated. He used anonymous text messages claiming they were messages from God or angels to command and manipulate members. These messages urged obedience, justified suffering, and reinforced his authority. What recipients believed were divine instructions were, in reality, carefully crafted messages sent by Fossmo himself. The psychological damage was profound. Members began to experience constant anxiety, fear of divine punishment, and disconnection from their own moral instincts. Choices were no longer personal, they were spiritual tests administered by invisible authority. Fossmo had effectively inserted himself into the minds of his followers, reshaping their sense of reality. The situation escalated dramatically in January 2004. In Kunpi, Alexandra Fossmo, Helge Fossmo's wife, was found shot dead in her home. Not long after, another woman was seriously wounded in a separate shooting. The community was thrown into panic. Violence of this kind was unprecedented. Initially, Fossmo appeared to be a grieving husband, devastated but faithful. Few suspected the truth. Police investigations soon unraveled a far darker story. The shooter was identified as Sarah Svensson, a young woman deeply embedded in the congregation, one of Fossmo's most manipulated followers. During interrogation, Svensson revealed that she believed God had commanded her to kill. Her actions, she insisted, were not her own will but divine obedience. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered the horrifying mechanism behind those commands. The so-called messages from God were text messages sent by Helge Fossmo. He had groomed Svensson psychologically over years, breaking down her autonomy and filling the void with false divine narrative. Through constant reinforcement, emotional isolation, and religious manipulation, Fossmo convinced her that committing murder was an act of faith. Alexandra Fossmo's death was not random. It was a calculated step in a larger pattern of control. Evidence revealed that Fossmo wanted his wife out of the way so he could pursue other relationships within the congregation, free from scrutiny. Rather than divorce something that would have damaged his image, he chose secrecy, spiritual coercion, and manipulation leading to homicide. The revelation shocked Sweden. When Fossmo was arrested and charged, the case dominated national and international media. Court proceedings exposed a level of psychological abuse rarely seen so explicitly in religious contexts. Prosecutors laid out how Fossmo exploited faith, authority, and mental vulnerability to bend others to his will. Text messages were read aloud in court commands framed as divine law, slowly escalating from obedience to violence. In 2004, Helge Fossmo was convicted of instigating the murder of his wife and attempted murder of another woman. He received life imprisonment, a sentence reflecting both the severity of the crime and the extreme betrayal of trust involved. Sarah Svensson was convicted as well, though her sentence reflected recognition of the profound psychological manipulation she had endured. For former members of Kunpi Philadelphia, the trial was only the beginning of the aftermath. Many struggled to reconcile their memories with the truth. Relationships within the community collapsed. Parents questioned how they could have allowed their children to grow under such influence. Survivors described long-term trauma, panic disorders, nightmares, loss of identity, and an inability to trust not only religious leaders but their own judgment. Experts later classified Kunpi as a high-control religious environment, noting classic signs of cult dynamics, isolation, authoritarian leadership, suppression of dissent, and use of fear to enforce obedience. What made the case particularly chilling was how subtle and normalized the control had been wrapped in scripture. tradition, and community values. The church in Sweden faced intense scrutiny. How could such an environment exist without external intervention? Why were warning signs ignored? Critics argued that the fear of appearing intolerant toward religious expression allowed abuse to flourish unchecked. Years later, Fossmo continued to draw attention from prison. Reports emerged that he attempted to exert spiritual influence, even behind bars, raising new concerns about the durability of manipulative personalities once authority has been tasted. The Kanupi case stands as one of Europe's clearest examples of belief weaponized into violence. This was not a crime of passion or rage, was a crime of doctrine and control. Fossmo did not pull the trigger himself. He didn't need to. He had already reshaped another person's mind to do it for him. The deeper tragedy is not only that lives were lost, but that faith itself was used as the tool of destruction. The very system meant to guide morality became a mechanism for erasing it. When pastors preach heaven but live in sin, the fallout does not end at betrayal. It can escalate to annihilation. Trust becomes leverage, belief becomes a weapon, and the most terrifying realization follows. Evil does not always reject faith. Sometimes it studies it, then bends it to serve its darkest purpose. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more than 4 decades, Father Fernando Karadima was one of the most powerful and influential priests in Chile, a spiritual gatekeeper whose approval could determine who rose within the Catholic hierarchy and who remained invisible. From the outside, he appeared almost saintly, elderly, soft-spoken, deeply devout. Young seminarians sought him out, parents trusted him unquestioningly, and bishops shielded him instinctively. Yet behind the walls of his parish, faith was being twisted into a system of domination that left generations of men spiritually shattered. Born in 1930, Karadima entered the priesthood young and quickly established himself at El Bosque Parish in Santiago, a wealthy and influential district. From this position, he cultivated more than followers, he cultivated protégés. Young men with aspirations for priesthood were drawn to him, believing proximity to Karadima meant proximity to God. He presented himself as a spiritual father, healer, and moral compass. What he actually offered was control. Karadima's influence did not come from overt force. It came from proximity to power and the mystique of holiness. He discouraged external friendships, encouraged isolation, and fostered intense emotional dependency. Confession became surveillance. Spiritual guidance became leverage. Obedience was framed as the highest virtue, and dissent as spiritual failure. Those closest to him were expected to submit entirely to his teachings, his interpretations of God's will, and eventually, his physical presence. The abuse followed a chillingly ritualized pattern. Victims later described being summoned for private meetings, framed as moments of grace or correction. Karadima blurred boundaries deliberately, using prolonged physical contact and invasive behavior while insisting it was spiritually purifying. Any discomfort was reframed as temptation or weakness. Victims were told their reactions proved moral deficiency, not wrongdoing by the priest. Fear ruled everything. Karadima warned victims that speaking out would destroy the church, damn their souls, or ruin their future vocation. He convinced many that silence was holiness and endurance was obedience. Some were told directly that reporting abuse would mark them as liars, sinners, or enemies of God. What made Karadima especially dangerous was not just his behavior, but his network. He mentored future bishops. He influenced Vatican appointments. This meant that when victims eventually tried to speak, their complaints were filtered through disciples who owed their careers to the man being accused. Investigations stalled. Reports vanished. Accusations were dismissed as misunderstandings or spiritual attacks. For years, nothing happened. The damage compounded in silence. Victims struggled with depression, addiction, and shattered identities. Some abandoned religious life entirely. Others stayed, trapped by guilt and fear. Their suffering was invisible, absorbed into a system that prioritized reputation over truth. It wasn't until the 2000s that the barrier finally cracked. Survivors, now adults, joined forces and went public. Their testimonies were detailed, consistent, and devastating. They spoke not just of abuse, but of systematic psychological control. The stories spread beyond Chile, carried by journalists who traced Karadima's reach through church hierarchies like roots beneath the soil. The Vatican could no longer ignore it. In 2011, following internal investigation, The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith found Karadima guilty of abuse of minors and abuse of power. The punishment, however, stunned many. Rather than prison, Karadima was sentenced to a life of prayer and penance, effectively house arrest within a convent. To survivors, it felt like another betrayal. The scandal detonated outward. Attention turned to Karadima's protégés, men who had defended him, dismissed victims, and obstructed justice. Among them were influential Chilean bishops who would later face resignations amid mounting pressure. Trust in the Catholic Church in Chile collapsed almost overnight. Public outrage reached historic levels. Demonstrations filled the streets. Churches emptied. Victims demanded accountability, not only for Karadima, but for every official who enabled him. The case became emblematic of global clerical abuse, proof that corruption did not always take the form of rogue individuals, but of institutional complicity. Karadima remained defiant until the end. He denied wrongdoing, expressed no remorse, and died in 2021 without ever confronting his victims directly. For many survivors, his death was not closure, it was confirmation that justice delayed is often justice denied. The enduring damage, however, could not be buried with him. Chile's relationship with religious authority changed permanently. Faith gave way to skepticism. Obedience gave way to scrutiny. The image of sanctity that once protected abusers was irreparably cracked. Father Fernando Karadima preached holiness, discipline, and devotion. He inspired vocations and shaped careers, but behind that image, he built a system of fear that used God as justification and silence as currency. His story reveals a darker truth about corruption in religion. Sometimes the greatest crimes are committed not loudly, but gently, through whispered guidance, trusted authority, and years of silence enforced by fear. When pastors preach heaven but live in sin, the damage is not confined to victims alone. It radiates outward, poisoning institutions, destroying trust, and leaving entire nations to ask the same haunting question. How many warnings were heard and ignored before faith became a prison? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Jerry Falwell Sr., a towering figure in American evangelicalism, became both a spiritual icon and a source of controversy, blurring the lines between faith, political influence, and personal gain. Born in 1933 in Lynchburg, Virginia, Falwell rose from modest beginnings to found the influential Thomas Road Baptist Church, eventually expanding his reach to national politics, television, and educational institutions. While many celebrated him as a devout leader, critics argued that his actions often prioritized personal influence and financial gain over spiritual guidance, raising ethical questions about the intersection of faith, power, and profit. Falwell's rise began with his charismatic preaching style. As a young minister, he combined traditional Baptist doctrine with passionate rhetoric that resonated deeply with congregants in Lynchburg and beyond. His sermons emphasized conservative social values, personal morality, and the moral responsibility of the faithful to shape society. This messaging, delivered with fiery conviction, attracted thousands of followers and positioned him as a central figure in the burgeoning evangelical movement. By the 1960s and 1970s, Falwell had established Thomas Road Baptist Church as a prominent institution. He founded Liberty University, a conservative Christian college that became a flagship of evangelical education. Through this platform, he extended his influence, drawing students, donors, and political attention. At the same time, Falwell entered television and radio, creating a media presence that amplified his message to millions nationwide. His ability to blend spiritual authority with media-savvy tactics allowed him to cultivate a following that extended far beyond the local congregation. Despite public acclaim, Falwell's methods and motivations often sparked debate. Critics accused him of using religion to consolidate power, funnel donations into personal projects, and gain political leverage. Church finances, while technically separate from his personal accounts, were managed in ways that critics argued allowed him disproportionate control and benefit. High-profile fundraising campaigns, media ventures, and expansion of educational institutions created financial empires tied directly to his personal influence. Falwell's political engagement further complicated his legacy. He was instrumental in founding the Moral Majority in the late 1970s, a conservative political movement that mobilized evangelical Christians into the American political sphere. While framed as a moral crusade, many argued that his initiatives served to increase his national profile and consolidate influence over both religious and civic institutions. Through these channels, he gained access to prominent political figures, legislative platforms, and media coverage, allowing him to shape public discourse while reinforcing his authority as a spiritual leader. The most controversial aspects of Falwell's career involved the overlap of personal gain and spiritual authority. He received substantial compensation from the institutions he founded, controlled significant financial resources, and wielded influence in ways that critics described as ethically questionable. Detractors argued that his messaging, particularly around social issues, often served to solidify his power and attract donations rather than purely guide spiritual growth. In this context, the line between preaching heaven and living comfortably and controversially became a focal point of national debate. Allegations of personal indulgence further fueled public scrutiny. Investigative journalists reported on lavish spending, high salaries, and the use of institutional resources to support lifestyle choices that seemed inconsistent with a strict moral code. He preached, while Falwell defended these expenditures as necessary for institutional growth. The contrast between his rhetoric of sacrifice, humility, and spiritual discipline and the reality of his personal benefits raised questions about integrity and accountability. Legal and financial oversight of Falwell's enterprises, while generally compliant with U.S. law, was often criticized for lacking transparency. Liberty University's rapid growth, for example, relied heavily on donations, which critics argued were solicited through emotionally charged appeals that emphasized spiritual obligation and moral duty. Falwell's position as founder and leader gave him significant control over allocation and oversight, creating an environment where faith, money, and personal influence were deeply intertwined. The fallout from these controversies emerged both during his life and posthumously. Falwell's passing in 2007 sparked widespread reflection on his dual legacy. A man of profound influence and enduring spiritual leadership, yet also a figure whose actions blurred ethical lines and raised questions about the exploitation of religious authority. Scholars, theologians, and journalists continue to debate the implications of his career, particularly regarding the balance between personal benefit, spiritual guidance, and the responsibilities of public religious figures. Critics argue that Falwell's life illustrates the dangers inherent in concentrated spiritual authority. When a pastor accumulates vast influence over both faith and finances, the potential for exploitation, intentional or systemic, is, even in the absence of overt criminality, the impact on congregants, students, and the broader public can be profound. Individuals may be guided by faith into decisions that serve the leader's interests more than their own spiritual development, highlighting the ethical complexities of religious leadership intertwined with wealth and political power. Supporters of Falwell, however, emphasize his impact on evangelical education, moral advocacy, and civic engagement. They argue that his leadership fostered community cohesion, strengthened religious identity, and provided opportunities for millions to engage with faith-driven social initiatives. The tension between public benefit and private gain remains central to understanding his complex legacy, illustrating that leaders can simultaneously inspire and exploit, uplift, and manipulate. Even decades after his death, Falwell's story serves as a cautionary tale. His rise from humble beginnings to a national religious and political figure underscores the power of charisma, organization, and media savvy in shaping influence. Yet, it also reminds observers that authority can be wielded to serve both altruistic and self-serving ends. Communities, scholars, and religious institutions continue to grapple with questions arising from his life: how to balance influence with accountability, how to protect congregants from exploitation, and how to discern when spiritual guidance is being used as a tool for personal gain. For the broader American public, Falwell's legacy is both inspirational and unsettling. His ability to mobilize faith communities, create enduring institutions, and shape public discourse demonstrates remarkable leadership. Simultaneously, his personal enrichment, political maneuvering, and ethical controversies illustrate how religious authority can be manipulated when accountability is limited. In the end, the story of Jerry Falwell Sr. forces a difficult reflection. When a pastor preaches heaven but lives in comfort and influence, who truly benefits? And for those who trust, follow, and give, what is the cost of faith when morality and personal gain collide? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Robert Tilton, once one of the most prominent figures in American televangelism, became infamous for his extravagant lifestyle, manipulative fundraising tactics, and exploitation of the faithful. Born in 1946 in Louisville, Texas, Tilton grew up in modest circumstances, demonstrating an early aptitude for persuasion, public speaking, and leadership. These traits served him well as he entered ministry, eventually leading him to television, where his blend of charismatic preaching and entrepreneurial savvy would earn him millions and controversy. Tilton's ministry, Success and Life Church, gained traction in the 1970s and 1980s by broadcasting sermons and faith-based programs to a national audience. Unlike traditional pastoral approaches, Tilton emphasized prosperity theology, the belief that faith, devotion, and generous donations would be rewarded with material blessings. He combined fiery sermons with elaborate television production, creating an immersive spiritual experience designed to captivate viewers and inspire financial contributions. Central to Tilton's approach was a direct appeal to the faithful. Viewers were encouraged to send donations via mail, often with the promise that their generosity would be multiplied through divine blessing. These appeals were emotionally charged, with Tilton framing contributions as a tangible expression of faith that could transform lives. The method proved extraordinarily effective. Millions of Americans sent money to his ministry, ranging from small donations to life savings, trusting that their faith would be reciprocated in blessings and miracles. By the mid-1980s, Tilton had amassed substantial wealth, purchasing luxury homes, expensive vehicles, and high-end equipment for his television productions. The outward appearance of prosperity reinforced his message of divine reward, creating a feedback loop where financial success became both proof of faith and a tool to encourage further donations. Congregants and viewers saw Tilton as a conduit to God's favor, a figure whose material success was evidence of spiritual authority. However, investigative journalists began to uncover troubling details about the operations behind Tilton's televised ministry. Reports revealed that much of the money sent by viewers had been misappropriated or diverted into personal enrichment. Mailings often solicited donations under misleading pretenses, implying that gifts would directly fund charitable or miraculous projects, when in reality funds supported Tilton's lifestyle and the expensive production of his broadcasts. The revelations sparked outrage among viewers, media outlets, and regulators. In 1991, a 2020's investigative report aired footage showing Tilton's ministry discarding prayer requests and donation envelopes without processing them, highlighting the disconnect between the promises made to viewers and the actual use of funds. This expose confirmed suspicions that faith had been commodified, and that Tilton's operation was as much a business as a ministerial bayet, one exploiting deeply held beliefs for financial gain. Legal investigations followed, including inquiries by the Federal Trade Commission and the Internal Revenue Service. While Tilton avoided criminal prosecution in most instances, he faced lawsuits, fines, and civil penalties. The controversies tarnished his reputation, diminished public trust, and resulted in a dramatic reduction in the financial support his ministry received. Yet, despite these setbacks, Tilton continued to preach, maintain a television presence, and rebuild aspects of his ministry, demonstrating both resilience and the enduring appeal of charismatic religious figures. The psychological impact on his followers was profound. Many described feelings of betrayal, confusion, and disillusionment after realizing that the promises of divine reward had been used to justify material exploitation. Devotees who had contributed generously often faced financial hardship, compounding emotional trauma with tangible losses. Scholars of religious manipulation cite Tilton as a clear example of how authority, charisma, and the perceived moral legitimacy of religious leaders can be leveraged to exploit trust. Tilton's story also raised broader ethical questions about televangelism, media, and the commercialization of faith. His methods illustrated a model in which religious authority could be used as a tool for persuasion, emotional manipulation, and wealth accumulation, particularly when oversight and accountability were limited. Regulatory bodies and watchdog organizations emphasized the need for transparency, financial reporting, and ethical standards to protect vulnerable followers and maintain public trust in religious institutions. Despite the scandal, Tilton's life and career reveal a complex portrait. Supporters argue that his broadcasts brought comfort, hope, and inspiration to millions, providing a sense of community and spiritual engagement. Critics counter that his exploitation of faith for personal gain caused irreparable harm, undermining trust in religious leadership and demonstrating the dangers of unregulated spiritual authority. Tilton's legacy is a cautionary tale for believers and institutions alike. His career underscores the vulnerability of individuals who place absolute trust in charismatic leaders, particularly when such leaders combine religious authority with media influence and financial control. The story demonstrates the necessity of vigilance, accountability, and ethical oversight in faith-based organizations, emphasizing that spiritual guidance should not be leveraged for personal profit at the expense of the faithful. Even decades later, Robert Tilton's name evokes both nostalgia and controversy. He remains a study in the power of charisma, media, and the promise of divine favor, a potent combination that, when misused, can transform faith into a vehicle for exploitation. Survivors of his ministry continue to grapple with the emotional and financial fallout, reflecting on the ease with which trust, hope, and devotion can be manipulated by those in positions of spiritual authority. In the end, Tilton's story forces a stark reflection. When a pastor preaches heaven but turns prayer into profit, who truly benefits and who pays the cost? The enduring lesson is clear. Even the most sincere-seeming spiritual guidance can hide motives that exploit the faithful, leaving lasting scars on individuals and communities alike. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Eddie Long, a once revered figure in American megachurch circles, became a symbol of both spiritual influence and moral controversy. Born in 1953 in Charlotte, North Carolina, Long rose from humble beginnings to lead New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, one of the largest and most influential African American churches in the United States. With a magnetic presence, an authoritative preaching style, and an ability to connect personally with congregants, Long cultivated immense loyalty and trust. However, beneath this exterior of spiritual guidance lay allegations of exploitation and abuse that would challenge the perception of faith, trust, and pastoral authority. Long's ministry grew rapidly during the 1990s and 2000s, fueled by his compelling sermons, community outreach, and ability to inspire devotion among thousands. He emphasized prosperity theology, teaching that faith, obedience, and giving would result in both spiritual and material blessings. The message resonated deeply with congregants, many of whom sought hope, direction, and stability amid socio-economic challenges. Long's charisma and personal attention to members, combined with high-energy worship services, fostered an environment where he was both admired and regarded as infallible. By the mid-2000s, New Birth Missionary Baptist Church had grown into a sprawling institution, boasting tens of thousands of members, multiple campuses, and substantial financial resources. Long leveraged this influence to extend his reach beyond the local congregation, engaging in media appearances, publishing books, and hosting televised sermons. His public persona was that of a devoted pastor, a community leader, and a moral guide whose life exemplified the values he preached. However, in 2010, Long's carefully cultivated image was shattered by a series of lawsuits filed by young men alleging sexual misconduct, coercion, and abuse of authority. The plaintiffs, many of whom were members or former members of the church's youth and leadership programs, claimed that Long had exploited his position of spiritual authority to initiate sexual relationships under the guise of mentorship and guidance. The allegations were deeply disturbing, as they highlighted the ways in which power, trust, and religious authority could be manipulated to prey upon vulnerable individuals. The lawsuit sparked national outrage and intense media scrutiny. Reports detailed how Long's influence within the church created an environment where questioning authority was discouraged, and obedience was framed as a moral and spiritual imperative. Congregants were often taught to view Long's guidance as divinely inspired, which intensified the psychological impact on those alleging abuse. Critics emphasized that Long's dual role as spiritual leader and moral authority amplified his ability to manipulate trust, making the allegations even more shocking. Long initially denied the allegations, framing them as attempts to defame his character and undermine his ministry. However, the sheer number of accusers, combined with corroborating details and investigative reporting, painted a disturbing picture of systemic abuse. The lawsuits were eventually settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, leaving Long facing public condemnation, damaged credibility, and lasting questions about accountability in megachurch settings. The impact on New Birth Missionary Baptist Church and its congregation was profound. Members experienced disillusionment, anger, and betrayal, struggling to reconcile the pastor they had admired with the allegations of abuse. Long's personal charisma, combined with his institutional authority, had fostered deep trust, making the revelations of misconduct all the more painful. Psychologists studying the case emphasized the long-term emotional consequences for congregants, including feelings of guilt, complicity, and shaken faith, beyond the immediate legal and emotional fallout. Long's case sparked broader discussions about oversight, accountability, and the structure of megachurch leadership. Scholars and religious ethicists highlighted the dangers of concentrated authority in large congregations, where the pastor's word is often considered unquestionable and institutional checks are weak or informal. The case prompted calls for stronger governance, independent auditing, and formalized reporting channels to protect congregants from abuse of power. The Long scandal also prompted conversations about the intersection of prosperity theology, charisma, and exploitation. By linking material success and spiritual obedience, leaders could foster environments where questioning authority seemed incompatible with faith. Congregants eager to achieve spiritual and material blessings might overlook or rationalize unethical behavior, highlighting the psychological mechanisms that can facilitate abuse within religious institutions. Despite the scandal, Eddie Long continued to maintain influence within certain circles until his death in 2017, while some congregants remained loyal. Citing his prior contributions to their spiritual lives, others distanced themselves, reflecting on the betrayal of trust and the ethical failures exposed by the lawsuits. Long's story serves as a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of faith communities to the misuse of authority and the enduring consequences of spiritual exploitation. The legacy of Eddie Long underscores a central tension in religious leadership. The power to inspire and guide can also be weaponized to exploit and manipulate. His life illustrates how charisma, institutional authority, and perceived moral infallibility can create a dangerous environment for the vulnerable. For survivors, families, and observers, the case offers lessons about vigilance, accountability, and the critical importance of separating personal authority from spiritual influence. Even years after the lawsuits and public scandal, Long's story resonates as a reminder that spiritual leadership carries immense responsibility. When that responsibility is abused, the emotional, psychological, and societal costs are staggering. Communities must balance respect for authority with critical oversight, ensuring that trust is never weaponized for personal gain or gratification. In the end, Pastor Eddie Long's life and ministry challenged the simplest assumptions about faith and morality. He preached salvation, guidance, and divine favor. Yet the allegations and legal settlements reveal a darker reality where trust was manipulated, authority was abused, and faith became a tool for personal exploitation. His story leaves an indelible mark on American religious life, a somber reflection on how those entrusted with spiritual guidance can profoundly betray the very people they claim to serve. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. The stories you've seen today reveal a chilling reality behind the sermons, the smiles, and the promises of salvation. Some pastors exploited faith for wealth, power, and personal gratification. From charismatic megachurch leaders to televangelists with national followings, these individuals manipulated trust, preyed on vulnerability, and left communities grappling with betrayal and disillusionment. Faith is sacred, but when authority is abused, the consequences are real, lasting, and devastating. Subscribe to explore more deep investigations into the hidden truths behind those who claim to lead with morality but act with deception. Like this video if these stories opened your eyes to the dark intersections of faith and power, and share to ensure others are aware of the warning signs and lessons these cases provide. Because when trust is weaponized, vigilance becomes a responsibility, and knowing the truth is the first step toward protecting yourself and your community from those who preach heaven but live in sin.